Humanity has answered one question again and again throughout history, without ever asking it out loud. Why do we love the powerful but not the just? Why do we celebrate those who hold the sword, but silence those who speak the truth? Why are cities remembered by the names of their conquerors, while those who tried to protect them disappear from memory? This question is not only about the past, it lives inside the present because the same choice is still being made every day, in every society, and inside every individual. We still turn our eyes toward power because power is loud, while justice is quiet. Power is visible, while justice is felt. Power creates fear, while justice demands conscience. And throughout history, humanity has chosen fear over conscience because fear feels safer. The first humans did not live with ideas of fairness or rights, but they understood strength. The strong hunter survived, the weak one vanished. There was no justice, only survival, and that instinct never disappeared. It only changed its shape. The cave became the city. The club became law, but the logic remained the same. Strength promised protection. Justice demanded time, patience, and risk, and when humans face danger, they seek immediate certainty, not slow truth. That is why the first leaders in history were not the most moral, but the most powerful. They were followed not because they were right, but because they were feared, and fear creates belonging. Fear is shared. Conscience is lonely. Conscience keeps you awake at night. Power lets you sleep. It tells you, do not think, I will think. For you, do not question, I will decide for you. And humanity accepted this bargain because thinking is responsibility, and responsibility is frightening. Justice always asks questions. Why is this allowed? Why are you silent? Why do you obey? Power, on the other hand, gives answers because I said so. And history shows that people prefer answers to questions, even when those answers are false, because lies are comfortable while truth is heavy. That is why those who spoke the truth were often labeled dangerous, because they disturbed the calm created by power. They broke the silence, and humanity has always preferred silence to sound, because silence feels safe. The just rarely gathered crowds, because justice does not create masses, it creates individuals. Power crushes individuals and shapes masses, and inside a mass, people no longer feel their own fear. That is why empires were built on obedience, not fairness. Obedience does not question obedience. Rests. Humanity did not choose power because it loved it. Humanity chose power because it could not endure justice. Because justice demands change, while power allows adaptation, and humanity has always feared change more than oppression. And this fear guided its choices across centuries. The form evolved, the names changed, but the pattern remained, and today, the same question still stands. Do we truly love the powerful, or are we simply not ready for justice? The powerful are remembered, while the just are often silenced, and this pattern has repeated itself so consistently throughout history that it no longer feels like an accident, but like a rule. Humanity rarely remembers those who were right. It remembers those who won, because memory is not built on truth. It is built on dominance. Statues are raised for conquerors, not for those who warned against conquest. Empires preserve the names of rulers, not the voices of those who questioned them. Because power does more than control land. It controls narrative. It decides what is recorded, what is taught, and what is forgotten. The just are dangerous not because they threaten violence, but because they threaten legitimacy. They ask questions that power cannot answer without exposing itself, and for this reason they are removed, ignored, discredited, or erased. Silence becomes a tool not only to stop dissent, but to rewrite reality over time. The absence of a voice slowly turns into the absence of a memory, and eventually, the absence of a person. History then appears clean, orderly, and inevitable, even though it was built on suppression. Humanity accepts this because power offers certainty, while justice offers responsibility. Power tells people where to stand, who to follow, and what to believe. Justice tells them to think, to doubt, and to choose. And choice is frightening, especially when choosing wrongly carries consequences. The powerful create fear, but fear unites people. Fear creates crowds. Fear makes individuals feel protected. Inside obedience, justice, on the other hand, isolates it, strips away excuses, and forces individuals to face their own silence. This is why societies instinctively move toward strength instead of righteousness. Strength feels like safety, while justice feels like risk over centuries. This instinct hardened into tradition. Kings became heroes, wars became glorious, and obedience became virtue, while those who resisted were labeled traitors, heretics, or fools, even when time eventually proves them right. That recognition comes too late, long after their voices were crushed and their lives destroyed. Humanity tells itself that history corrects its mistakes, but correction without memory is meaningless because it costs nothing to honor the dead while continuing to silence the living. The uncomfortable truth is that the powerful are remembered, not because they deserve it, but because they leave no space for alternatives, and the just are silenced, not because they are weak, but because their existence exposes a choice humanity would rather not admit. It keeps choosing power over justice, not out of cruelty, but out of fear. Fear of uncertainty, fear of responsibility, fear of standing alone, and until that fear is confronted, history will continue to remember strength while burying truth in silence. Power promises safety while justice demands risk, and this difference lies at the core of nearly every choice humanity has ever made. Power speaks the language of protection. It offers walls, armies, laws, and authority. It tells people that as long as they obey, they will be spared uncertainty, hunger, chaos, and isolation. Justice offers none of these guarantees. Justice does not promise survival. It promises meaning, and meaning is costly because it requires action, accountability, and courage. When humans face danger, they instinctively search for something solid, something immediate, something that removes the burden of choice, and power does exactly that. It simplifies the world into commands and consequences, while justice complicates it with questions, responsibility, and doubt. Throughout history, societies aligned themselves with strength, not because strength was right, but because it felt safe. Empires rose not on moral truth, but on the promise of order. Kings were accepted not because they were just, but because they reduced fear, even if that reduction came at the cost of freedom. Justice, by contrast, always introduces instability. It asks people to stand without shields, to speak without protection, and to act without certainty. It exposes individuals to punishment, exclusion, and loss, which is why those who choose justice are so often left alone. Power allows people to survive within a system. Justice forces them to confront the system itself, and confronting a system is far more dangerous than living inside it. This is why safety has always been more attractive than righteousness, and why power continues to be rewarded while justice is postponed, admired only after the risk has already destroyed those who carried it. Humanity does not reject justice because it is evil. It rejects justice because it is afraid, and fear will always choose protection over truth as long as survival feels uncertain. Power frees the individual from responsibility, while justice places the weight of responsibility directly on the human conscience. And this difference explains why power has always been more attractive than righteousness. Power does not ask who you are or what you believe. It asks only whether you obey. Once obedience is given, the burden of choice disappears. Decisions are no longer personal. They are externalized. The system thinks, commands, and acts on your behalf. And this creates a powerful illusion of freedom because the individual no longer feels accountable for outcomes. Violence, injustice, and cruelty can be justified as necessity, as orders, as inevitability. Power allows people to say, "I did not choose this. It was decided above me," and this sentence has protected more wrongdoing than any weapon in history. Justice offers no such shelter. Justice removes the hiding place. It returns choice to the individual, and with choice comes responsibility. Responsibility for action, responsibility for silence, responsibility for participation, and responsibility for consequence. A just person cannot outsource morality to authority, cannot dissolve guilt into hierarchy, cannot escape by blending into the crowd. Justice forces the individual to remain awake while power allows sleep. This is why power feels liberating. It releases people from the exhausting work of moral judgment. It simplifies life into roles, duties, and permissions, while justice complicates life by insisting that every action matters and every silence speaks throughout history. Those who aligned themselves with power often felt free, not because they were unconstrained, but because they were unburdened. Their freedom was the freedom of not having to think, not having to resist, and not having to answer for the harm caused in their name. Justice, by contrast, creates a heavier existence. It demands that individuals remain conscious, even when consciousness is painful. It asks them to choose correctly, even when the cost is personal: loss, exclusion, punishment, or death. This is why just individuals so often appear troubled, isolated, or exhausted, while those close to power appear confident, relaxed, and certain. Power reassures, justice unsettles. Power says, "Follow and you will be protected." Justice says, "Stand and you will be exposed." And exposure is terrifying because it removes the comfort of collective excuse under power. Guilt is diluted among many under justice. Guilt is singular and unavoidable. History shows again and again that when faced with this choice, most people instinctively reach for the relief that power offers, rather than the burden that justice demands. They prefer delegated morality over personal integrity, because integrity has consequences. Power creates distance between action and conscience. Justice collapses that distance, completely forcing individuals to face themselves without mediation. And this confrontation is deeply uncomfortable. It reveals fear, cowardice, and compromise, qualities people would rather not see in themselves. Power hides these truths behind uniforms, laws, traditions, and rituals. Justice strips them away and leaves only the human being and the decision they must make. This is why societies reward obedience more consistently than righteousness, why loyalty is praised more often than courage, and why systems survive not through justice, but through the promise of relief from responsibility. The paradox is that power does not truly free anyone. It only postpones accountability, while justice, though heavy, is the only path that grants real moral freedom. Yet moral freedom is rarely chosen because it offers no protection, no permission, and no excuse. Only the truth of one's actions and the weight of living with them. Power gives human beings a sense of belonging, while justice leads them into loneliness, and this distinction reaches into the deepest layers of human psychology, because from the beginning of civilization, survival depended not on being right, but on being part of the group. To belong meant protection, food, shelter, and identity, while exclusion meant vulnerability, danger, and often death. Power understands this instinct and uses it. Power gathers people into crowds, uniforms, nations, faiths, and ideologies. It creates symbols, slogans, rituals, and enemies, and through these it offers a powerful emotional promise. You are not alone. You are part of something larger. You are protected because you belong. Justice offers no such comfort. Justice rarely speaks in the language of crowds. It speaks in the language of conscience, and conscience is solitary. It does not shout, it whispers, and it often whispers against the noise of the group. This is why those who follow justice so often find themselves isolated, not because they reject others, but because others reject the discomfort that justice brings. Power tells people who they are. Justice asks them who they choose to be. Power dissolves individuality into collective identity, making people feel strong simply by standing together, while justice pulls the individual out of the crowd and forces them to stand alone with their thoughts, doubts, and decisions. Belonging feels warm. It reduces fear by spreading it across many shoulders. Loneliness concentrates fear into one. This is why societies instinctively reward loyalty to power with acceptance and punish alignment with justice through exclusion. Throughout history, dissenters were not only imprisoned or killed, they were first isolated, labeled traitors, heretics, troublemakers, outsiders, because social death often hurts more than physical punishment. Power knows that the fear of loneliness is stronger than the fear of injustice, so it weaponizes belonging. It teaches people that safety lies in agreement, that virtue lies in conformity, and that survival lies in silence. Justice threatens this structure because it creates individuals who cannot dissolve themselves into the group, individuals who feel accountable not to authority, but to truth. And such individuals are dangerous, not because they are violent, but because they cannot be absorbed. They remain visibly separate, and their separation exposes the fragility of collective certainty. When one person stands apart, it forces others to confront a question they would rather avoid. Why am I standing where I am standing? Most people respond to this discomfort by pulling away from the just person, rather than pulling toward the truth, because rejoining the group feels easier than reevaluating one's position. Power thus offers emotional shelter. It says, "Stay with us, and you will not be alone." Justice offers no shelter. It says, "Stand where you must, even if no one stands with you." This is why justice has always been carried by minorities, by isolated figures, by solitary voices, whose strength came not from numbers, but from conviction. And this loneliness is not accidental. It is the cost of refusing collective self-deception. Power turns belonging into a substitute for morality. Justice strips that substitute away and leaves only the individual and their responsibility to truth. And because humans are social creatures who fear abandonment as deeply as death, most choose the warmth of belonging over the cold clarity of justice. Again and again, across centuries, cultures, and systems, until loneliness itself becomes proof of deviance and conformity, becomes proof of virtue. And in this world, power feels like home, while justice feels like exile. History does not record what was right. It records what survived, and survival has always favored the victor over the Just because history is not a neutral memory, it is a construction shaped by power. Those who win wars control archives, monuments, education, and narrative, while those who lose are erased, simplified, or condemned. The pen that writes history is held by those who remain standing, not by those who spoke the truth and were destroyed. This is why conquest is remembered as glory, while resistance is remembered as rebellion, why obedience becomes virtue, while dissent becomes crime. The victorious do not need to prove their righteousness. They only need to endure long enough to define reality. Once power is secured, its version of events hardens into fact. Children are taught it, books repeat it, rituals reinforce it, and over time, repetition replaces truth. The just rarely leave records because their lives are interrupted, silenced, or cut short. Their words survive only as fragments, rumors, footnotes, or accusations written by their enemies. History therefore becomes a map of dominance rather than morality. It celebrates expansion, not restraint; authority, not conscience; order, not justice. And because people learn the past through this distorted lens, they internalize a dangerous lesson that success equals correctness, that power equals legitimacy, and that survival justifies everything. This belief then feeds the next generation of violence, creating a self-perpetuating cycle where each new victor points to history as proof of righteousness. Even though history itself was written under coercion, those who challenged power threatened this illusion, which is why they had to disappear. Not only physically but narratively erasing a person from memory is the final victory, because once forgotten, they can no longer question the present. Yet time occasionally fractures this narrative centuries later. Names resurface, ideas return, and suppressed truths are rediscovered. But this delayed recognition changes nothing for those who paid the price. Justice offered too late is not justice. It is consolation, for the living humanity comforts itself by saying that history eventually vindicates the just. But this belief ignores a harsher reality. History corrects nothing, it only rearranges memory after the damage is done. And because the living continue to learn from a past shaped by winners, they continue to imitate power rather than principle, mistaking dominance for destiny, until the same pattern repeats again. The next war, the next silence, the next erasure. History does not remember the just because remembrance requires power, and those who possess power rarely need justice to justify themselves. Power operates through fear, while justice demands courage, and this distinction explains why power spreads quickly, while justice moves slowly. Fear is immediate. It reaches the nervous system before thought. It triggers obedience before reflection, and it requires no understanding. Only submission power relies on this reflex. It does not need people to agree, it only needs them to comply. Fear shortens moral distance, it narrows vision, reduces complexity, and convinces individuals that survival is more important than truth under fear. Silence feels reasonable, conformity feels intelligent, and obedience feels responsible. Justice cannot function in this environment because justice requires the opposite state of mind. It requires awareness, presence, and willingness to accept consequences. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. And this decision cannot be automated, it cannot be imposed, and it cannot be shared equally. Courage isolates because it returns agency to the individual, while fear dissolves agency into the collective underpower. Fear becomes normalized, it is dressed as common sense, caution, loyalty, or realism, and people learn to confuse moral surrender with wisdom. They tell themselves that resistance is naive, that questioning authority is dangerous, that survival requires adaptation. Power rewards this thinking because it transforms fear into stability. Justice interrupts this process by exposing the cost of that stability. It forces people to confront the uncomfortable truth that safety built on silence is not safety but postponement. Justice asks individuals to speak when silence would protect them, to stand when obedience would shelter them, and to choose truth when fear offers excuses. This is why those who pursue justice often appear reckless or extreme to others, because courage looks irrational to a mind trained by fear. Throughout history, fear has been the most efficient political tool, not because it is cruel, but because it is effective. It spreads faster than ideas. It unites faster than values, and it disciplines without persuasion. Justice, by contrast, requires moral imagination. It requires the ability to see beyond immediate danger and to value integrity over comfort. And this capacity is rare, not because humans lack goodness, but because fear constantly trains them to prioritize survival over meaning. Power tells people that fear is realism. Justice tells them that courage is responsibility. And between these two messages, most choose realism because courage offers no guarantees. It does not promise victory, safety, or recognition. It only promises alignment between action and conscience. And this alignment often comes at great personal cost: isolation, punishment, loss, or death. Fear avoids these costs by offering compliance as a substitute for morality, and because fear feels rational while courage feels risky, societies learn to admire strength rather than bravery. They praise order rather than resistance, and they mistake quiet obedience for peace. This is why power endures even when it is unjust, and why justice so often emerges only in moments of collapse, when fear temporarily loses its grip and people are forced to confront the emptiness of survival. Without dignity until then, fear continues to govern behavior, shaping choices, memories, and identities, while courage remains exceptional, admired in hindsight but avoided in practice. Because power does not need courage to function. It only needs fear, and as long as fear remains easier than courage, justice will continue to demand what most are unwilling to give. Human beings hide their weakness inside power because power provides distance between who they are and what they fear to admit about themselves. Weakness is not only physical, it is fear, uncertainty, doubt, and the awareness of vulnerability. And these are states. Humans instinctively try to escape power, offers an escape by allowing individuals to merge with something larger than themselves, a system, an authority, a nation, an ideology, and within that structure, personal weakness becomes invisible when a person stands alone. Their fear is exposed, but when they stand behind power, their fear is reframed as loyalty, caution, realism, or necessity. Power allows people to mask insecurity as obedience and cowardice as discipline. It gives them language that transforms inner fragility into external justification. This is why people so often cling to powerful institutions, even when those institutions harm them, because inside power, they do not have to confront their own hesitation, their own silence, or their own compromises. Weakness demands self-examination. Power removes that demand. It replaces introspection with alignment and responsibility with hierarchy. Under power, individuals can say, "I am not afraid. I am simply following orders. I am not uncertain. The rules are clear. I am not weak. The system is strong." And this psychological transfer is deeply comforting because it converts internal conflict into external structure. Power absorbs doubt and returns certainty, even if that certainty is false. Justice, by contrast, strips away these protections. It exposes weakness rather than concealing it. It asks individuals to face fear without armor, to acknowledge uncertainty without permission, and to act without guarantees. This confrontation is deeply uncomfortable because it reveals how much of human behavior is driven not by conviction, but by avoidance. Power thrives on this avoidance. It gives people symbols, uniforms, titles, and identities that allow them to feel solid while remaining hollow inside. And the more fragile the individual feels, the more intensely they defend the power they depend on, because losing that power would mean facing themselves without protection. This is why people often react aggressively when power is questioned, not because they believe deeply in it, but because without it, their weakness would become visible. Criticism of power feels like a personal attack. Because power has become a psychological shelter throughout history, this dynamic repeated itself. Soldiers hid fear behind duty, citizens hid doubt behind patriotism, believers hid uncertainty behind doctrine, and officials hid moral compromise behind legality. Power did not remove weakness, it simply redistributed it, spreading it across structures so large that no single person felt accountable. Justice threatens this arrangement because it collapses the distance between action and self. It removes the shield and returns weakness to where it originated, inside the individual, and forces them to confront it without excuse. This is why justice feels unbearable to many. It does not flatter, it does not reassure, it does not protect. It reveals, and revelation is painful because it exposes the gap between who we claim to be and what we actually do. Power allows humans to live comfortably inside that gap. Justice does not, and so people defend power not because it makes them strong, but because it prevents them from seeing how fragile they truly are. And as long as power continues to offer this refuge from self-awareness, weakness will continue to hide behind authority, while justice remains something admired from a safe distance, but rarely embraced. Justice wins slowly while power delivers immediate reward. And this imbalance shapes human behavior more than morality ever has. Power provides instant reinforcement. It offers status, safety, recognition, and material benefit in the present moment, while justice rarely offers anything visible or immediate. Justice demands sacrifice first and meaning later, if meaning comes at all, and the human mind is not built to wait patiently for abstract validation when concrete rewards are available. Now, throughout history, those who aligned themselves with power were rewarded quickly with protection, influence, wealth, and belonging, while those who aligned themselves with justice were asked to endure loss, isolation, and punishment, without assurance that their suffering would ever be acknowledged. Power operates on short timelines. It rewards compliance immediately, because immediate reward reinforces loyalty. Justice operates on long timelines. It may take years, decades, or centuries before its value is recognized, and often that recognition comes after the individual who upheld it is already gone. This delay makes justice psychologically unattractive, because humans are wired to respond to short-term incentives. Fear and reward shape behavior far more effectively than delayed moral satisfaction. Power understands this and uses it strategically. It punishes resistance swiftly and rewards obedience instantly, creating a feedback loop where conformity feels rational and dissent feels foolish. Justice breaks this loop by refusing to bargain with timing. It asks individuals to act correctly even when the cost is immediate and the reward uncertain. This is why those who pursue justice are often portrayed as unrealistic, naive, or irresponsible, because from the perspective of immediate outcomes they appear to be losing, while those who pursue power appear to be winning. History then reinforces this illusion by recording victories rather than sacrifices, creating the false impression that power is always effective and justice is always impractical. Yet this is a distortion, because the success of power is measured in speed and visibility, while the success of justice is measured in depth and endurance. Justice does not conquer territories, it reshapes conscience, but conscience evolves slowly and quietly and cannot compete with the spectacle of immediate dominance. Humanity repeatedly chooses power not because it despises justice, but because it is impatient, because waiting for justice requires faith in a future that may never arrive. Power removes the need for that faith by offering certainty. Now, even if that certainty is built on injustice, this is why societies reward power in real time, while postponing justice into memory museums, apologies, and symbolic recognition long after the damage has been done. And this delayed acknowledgement serves as a moral alibi, allowing the present to continue repeating the same choices while honoring past victims at no cost. Justice arrives late, not because it is weak, but because it refuses to manipulate fear and reward. And in a world governed by immediacy, anything that moves slowly is mistaken for failure, even when it is the only thing that lasts. Justice wins late while power is rewarded immediately, and this imbalance quietly governs human choices far more than ideals ever could. Power speaks in the language of now. It offers safety, approval, status, money, and belonging in the present moment. It reassures people instantly that they made the right choice, because the reward arrives before doubt has time to grow. Justice offers nothing like this. Justice asks for sacrifice first. It demands loss, discomfort, and risk, without any guarantee that the future will ever recognize the cost. And the human mind struggles deeply with this delay, because humans are not built to live on distant moral promises. When immediate benefits are available, power understands this weakness and exploits it efficiently, rewarding obedience quickly and visibly while punishing resistance just as fast, creating a world where compliance feels intelligent and dissent feels self-destructive. Those who choose power often appear successful, not because they are right, but because their rewards are tangible and immediate, while those who choose justice appear to fail because their reward is invisible, delayed, or never arrives at all. History then reinforces this illusion by celebrating victories rather than integrity, by recording triumphs rather than sacrifices, and by teaching generations that effectiveness matters more than correctness. This teaches people a dangerous lesson, that what pays quickly must be right, and what costs deeply must be foolish. Justice is not slow because it is weak. It is slow because it refuses to manipulate fear or temptation. It does not bribe, it does not threaten, and it does not promise protection. It only promises alignment between action and conscience. And this alignment has no market value in systems driven by immediacy. Power thrives in short time frames. It flourishes in moments of crisis, urgency, and fear because these conditions suppress long-term thinking. Justice requires distance, patience, and reflection, qualities that collapse under pressure. This is why, in moments of instability, societies rush toward strong leaders, rigid systems, and decisive authority, even when those forces are destructive because they deliver the comfort of instant resolution. Justice cannot compete with that speed. It cannot offer relief on demand. It works quietly, reshaping values, slowly influencing thought, gradually altering behavior across generations, and because its victories are subtle, they are often unnoticed while power stages its success, loudly through symbols, ceremonies, rewards, and punishment. Humanity repeatedly chooses power not because it hates justice, but because it is impatient, because waiting for justice means tolerating uncertainty and living without immediate reassurance. Power removes that discomfort by rewarding compliance instantly, even if the reward is shallow, temporary, or built on harm. Later generations may look back and recognize where justice stood and where power abused, but that recognition costs nothing to those who receive it, while those who paid the price are already gone. And this delayed acknowledgement becomes a moral illusion, allowing societies to believe they value justice while continuing to reward power in practice again and again. Justice arrives late because it refuses to rush. Power wins early because it understands urgency. And until humanity learns to resist the seduction of immediate reward, justice will continue to be admired in memory, while power continues to be rewarded in real time. The most bitter truth is not that humanity chooses power over justice, but that it does so knowingly and repeatedly, while convincing itself that there was no other option. This truth is difficult to face because it removes the comfort of innocence. It reveals that silence was not always forced, that obedience was not always unavoidable, and that many moments labeled as necessity were in fact choices. Power survives, not only because it is strong, but because it is desired, because it offers relief from fear, relief from responsibility, and relief from the burden of standing alone. Justice threatens this relief because it exposes the gap between who people believe they are and what they are willing to do when safety is at stake. The most painful realization is that injustice rarely succeeds through violence alone. It succeeds through participation, through quiet acceptance, through the everyday decision to look away. And history is filled not only with tyrants, but with ordinary people who made power possible by choosing comfort over conscience. Humanity tells itself that evil is imposed from above, but the bitter truth is that it is sustained from below, through fear, rationalization, and adaptation. Justice does not fail because it lacks truth. It fails because truth demands transformation, and transformation is costly. It requires people to give up protection status, belonging, and certainty. Power asks for none of these sacrifices. It asks only for loyalty, and in return, it absorbs guilt and distributes excuses, allowing individuals to feel moral without acting morally. This is why the powerful are remembered and the just are silenced, not because justice is weak, but because it is uncompromising. It cannot be practiced halfway. It cannot be postponed without becoming meaningless. The most uncomfortable truth is that every era believes it would have acted differently than the past. Yet every era repeats the same pattern because the conditions remain the same. Fear, uncertainty, and the desire to survive. With minimal pain, humanity does not lack knowledge of what is right. It lacks the willingness to endure what doing right requires. And until this changes, justice will continue to arrive too late. Honored safely after its cost has already been paid by others, power will continue to be rewarded immediately, and history will continue to confuse success with legitimacy. The bitter truth is not that the world is unjust. The bitter truth is that injustice is often the easier choice, and humanity keeps choosing what is easier, while telling itself it had no choice at all. Justice is accepted only when it becomes safe, and this pattern reveals one of the most uncomfortable truths about human morality. People do not reject justice because they cannot recognize it. They reject it because recognizing it at the wrong moment carries risk. When justice is dangerous, it is ignored, denied, or silenced. But once the danger passes, it is embraced, celebrated, and moralized. This is why societies so often accept the truth only after it can no longer change anything, while those who spoke it when it mattered paid the price alone. History is filled with late apologies and symbolic gestures offered, long after the consequences are irreversible, because apology is easy when there is no longer power to confront, no system to dismantle, and no cost to bear. People tell themselves that time heals all wounds, but this is not healing, it is neutralization. Time does not resolve injustice, it removes the threat attached to acknowledging it. When speaking the truth could lead to punishment, exclusion, or death, silence is framed as realism, patience, or wisdom. But when the same truth becomes harmless, it is suddenly framed as courage and insight. This is how societies transform victims into heroes, only after ensuring they can no longer disrupt the present. A living just person is dangerous because they demand change, accountability, and action. A dead just person is safe because they demand nothing. This is why statues are built for people who were once condemned, and books praise figures who were once imprisoned, ignored, or destroyed. Honoring them costs nothing. It does not require redistribution of power, admission of guilt, or sacrifice in the present. It allows society to feel moral without becoming moral. This delayed recognition creates the illusion of progress, while preserving the same structures that caused the injustice in the first place. People comfort themselves by saying, history eventually gets it right. But this belief disguises a deeper failure. Justice acknowledged too late is not justice. It is narrative repair. It cleans memory without repairing harm, and it teaches future generations a dangerous lesson that it is acceptable to remain silent now because truth will be recognized later. This belief removes urgency and replaces responsibility with hope. Hope that time will absolve what conscience should confront. Immediately, the phrase "time solves" everything is not wisdom, it is avoidance. It shifts moral burden into the future where no one alive will be held accountable. And this is why injustice survives so easily. It does not need everyone to support it. It only needs most people to wait. Waiting allows power to entrench itself, while resistance fades, and when enough time has passed, the same society that once punished truth will claim ownership over it, rewriting its past to appear enlightened, without acknowledging its earlier complicity. Justice becomes a trophy displayed after the struggle is over, not a principle defended during the struggle, and this transformation empties justice of its meaning, because justice that arrives only when it is safe no longer challenges power, it serves it. It becomes a decorative value rather than a disruptive force, and the most bitter part of this cycle is that people sincerely believe they are honoring justice, while actively avoiding the moment when honoring it would have required courage loss or sacrifice. Societies do not fail to recognize justice. They fail to tolerate it when it threatens comfort, order, and security. And until justice is valued precisely when it is dangerous, not when it is harmless, history will continue to repeat this pattern, silencing the living while praising the dead and calling it moral growth. Human beings tend to label power as realism and justice as idealism, not because they misunderstand reality, but because realism has been redefined to mean survival with minimal risk, rather than truth with meaningful consequence in everyday language. Realism is no longer about seeing the world clearly, it is about adapting to it quietly. Power fits this definition perfectly because it aligns with what already exists. It works within the current structure, it accepts the rules as they are, and promises efficiency, predictability, and safety. Justice, on the other hand, questions those rules, and by doing so, it introduces uncertainty, which immediately feels impractical to minds trained by fear and scarcity. People call power realistic because it does not ask them to imagine a different world. It only asks them to navigate the one they are already trapped in, and this navigation feels intelligent because it avoids punishment and secures short-term stability. Justice demands something that realism, as commonly understood, cannot offer. It demands imagination, sacrifice, and the willingness to act without assurance of success. And in societies shaped by repeated crises, imagination is seen as dangerous rather than necessary. People learn that dreaming of fairness invites disappointment, while aligning with strength ensures survival. This conditioning turns cynicism into wisdom and surrender into intelligence. Phrases like "that is how the world works" become shields against moral responsibility, because they frame injustice as inevitability rather than choice. Power benefits enormously from this framing, because it transforms compliance into maturity and resistance into childishness. The just person is dismissed as naive, not because they are wrong, but because their refusal to adapt exposes the moral cost of adaptation. Realism becomes a way to avoid confronting that cost by pretending there was never an alternative. History reinforces this distortion by celebrating those who succeeded within unjust systems while forgetting those who challenged them and lost. And over time, success itself becomes proof of correctness. People assume that if power prevailed, it must have been realistic, while justice failed because it was impractical. But this reasoning confuses outcome with truth. It ignores the fact that power often wins precisely because it is willing to abandon ethical limits. While justice restrains itself, realism in this sense is not about accuracy, it is about endurance. It rewards those who bend rather than those who stand, and it teaches generations that integrity is admirable only when it does not interfere with survival. The cruel irony is that what is labeled realistic often produces long-term harm, instability, and collapse, while what is dismissed as idealistic often contains the only solutions capable of preventing those outcomes. Yet, because justice does not deliver immediate comfort, it is treated as a luxury rather than a necessity. People tell themselves they will support justice when conditions improve, not realizing that conditions improve only when justice is supported. The idea of realism thus becomes a self-fulfilling trap. It normalizes injustice by presenting it as unavoidable, and it frames moral courage as foolish risk. Taking this mental framework allows people to feel intelligent while doing nothing and responsible while remaining silent, and as long as realism is defined as obedience to power rather than fidelity to truth, justice will continue to be sidelined, admired in theory but rejected in practice, because a world shaped by fear will always mistake survival tactics for wisdom and call them realism, while dismissing the harder, more dangerous clarity of justice as fantasy. Justice often appears weak because its language was never designed to dominate. It was designed to reveal, and this difference shapes how it is perceived. In a world trained to respond to force, volume, and certainty, power speaks loudly. It uses commands, slogans, symbols, and repetition. It simplifies reality into clear binaries: us and them, order and chaos, loyalty and betrayal. And this simplicity gives power an immediate advantage, because the human mind, under stress, gravitates toward clarity rather than complexity. Justice does the opposite. It refuses to reduce reality into convenient absolutes. It acknowledges nuance, responsibility, and contradiction. And this makes its language slower, quieter, and harder to digest, especially for societies conditioned by fear. Justice asks people to listen while power demands that they obey. Justice explains while power declares justice, invites reflection while power imposes direction. And in environments where speed, urgency, and survival dominate, reflection is misread as hesitation, and hesitation is misread as weakness. The language of justice also lacks spectacle. It does not promise glory, victory, or dominance. It speaks of limits, restraint, and accountability, concepts that do not excite crowds or mobilize mass emotion. Power understands emotion better than truth. It amplifies anger, fear, pride, and belonging, because these emotions override critical thought. Justice speaks to conscience, which is subtle, internal, and easily drowned out by noise. This is why justice struggles in public arenas, where attention is currency and volume determines legitimacy. Power fills space. Justice leaves space, and silence is uncomfortable, because it forces people to confront their own thoughts. Many prefer the noise of authority to the quiet of moral clarity. Power also benefits from repetition. It repeats its narratives until they feel natural, while justice often appears fragmented because it resists oversimplification. Its arguments require context, history, and patience, qualities rarely rewarded in systems driven by immediacy. Justice also refuses to threaten, and in a world where threat has become the dominant form of persuasion, nonviolence is interpreted as inability. Justice does not punish disagreement, it tolerates it, and tolerance is mistaken for indecision. Power frames its certainty as strength, even when that certainty is built on falsehoods. Justice frames its doubt as honesty, and honesty is often perceived as weakness because it does not project control. The tragic irony is that justice appears weak precisely because it respects human intelligence. It assumes people are capable of understanding complexity, while power assumes they are not and designs its language accordingly. Justice trusts people, power manages them, and management always looks more effective than trust. In the short term, this is why societies repeatedly side with the voice that sounds confident rather than the one that sounds careful. They equate loudness with truth, speed with competence, and force with seriousness. While dismissing restraint as fragility, the language of justice is not weak, it is restrained, and restraint looks powerless in cultures obsessed with dominance. Yet over time, it is this restraint that allows justice to endure, because it does not collapse under contradiction or rely on fear to sustain itself. But endurance is quiet, and quiet does not impress in moments of crisis. So justice continues to be overshadowed, misunderstood, and ignored. not because it lacks strength, but because its strength does not perform. And in a world that confuses performance with power, anything that refuses to shout will always be mistaken for silence, and anything that refuses to threaten will always be mistaken for weakness. Being right so often leaves a person alone, because righteousness separates while conformity connects. And human beings are deeply social creatures who instinctively fear isolation more than error. From the earliest stages of human survival, belonging meant protection, warmth, and continuity, while exclusion meant danger, vulnerability, and often death. And this ancient fear never disappeared. It only evolved into social forms. Approval, reputation, acceptance, and safety. Power understands this instinct and uses it by rewarding agreement and punishing deviation. Justice disrupts it by creating distance between the individual and the group. A person who is right but refuses to align with the collective narrative exposes a fracture in shared certainty. And that fracture is deeply unsettling because it forces others to confront the possibility that they are complicit, mistaken, or silent when they should not be. And rather than face this discomfort, most people instinctively move away from the one who is right, distancing themselves, not because they disagree logically, but because proximity threatens their emotional stability. Being right demands consistency between belief and action, and this consistency is rare because it carries cost. Speaking truth isolates because it removes the protection of shared excuses. It collapses the comforting illusion that everyone is equally responsible and replaces it with a sharper reality that responsibility is personal and unavoidable under power. Guilt is distributed across many under justice. Guilt becomes singular, and this singularity is frightening because it cannot be diluted by numbers. When someone stands for what is right, they do not simply challenge authority. They challenge the silent agreement that allows the group to function comfortably. And groups react defensively to such challenges, not out of cruelty, but out of self-preservation. The presence of a just individual acts like a mirror, reflecting compromises, fears, and rationalizations that others would rather not see. And rather than change what they see, they reject the mirror throughout history. This pattern repeated endlessly. Whistleblowers, prophets, reformers, and dissenters were first isolated before they were punished, because social exclusion is often the most efficient way to neutralize moral threat. A person without allies appears unreasonable, unstable, or extreme, regardless of the validity of their claims. Loneliness becomes a narrative tool used to discredit truth. If no one stands with you, you must be wrong. Power reinforces this by equating majority with correctness and unity with virtue. Turning solitude into suspicion, justice cannot offer belonging, because belonging requires agreement, and justice often requires refusal. Refusal to lie, refusal to obey, refusal to remain silent, and refusal breaks bonds that are built on convenience rather than integrity. This is why those who choose justice often experience not only external isolation, but internal exhaustion, because standing alone requires constant self-affirmation without feedback, reassurance, or reward. It demands faith in principles rather than approval, and this faith must be renewed daily without confirmation. The tragic irony is that society later praises the same individuals it once abandoned, but that praise arrives only after their solitude can no longer disrupt anything living. Truth isolates because it demands response, while dead truth is safe because it demands nothing, and so people prefer to admire righteousness at a distance rather than endure it up close, because standing with someone who is right often means standing against comfort, safety, and belonging, and most people are not prepared to pay that price. The result is a world where being right is lonely, not because truth lacks allies, but because alignment with truth requires breaking the silent contracts that keep communities intact. and until belonging is redefined to include conscience rather than compliance, righteousness will continue to feel like exile, and solitude will remain the price of refusing collective self-deception. Human beings tend to love those who were right only after time has passed, because distance removes danger and memory removes responsibility, while admiration without consequence feels safe. A just person who is alive demands response change and action. They disrupt the present by forcing uncomfortable questions and exposing compromises that people would rather leave unexamined. But once that person is gone, their righteousness no longer threatens anything. It becomes symbolic rather than practical, and symbols are easy to celebrate because they require nothing in return. History repeatedly transforms persecuted figures into moral icons. Only after their voices can no longer challenge existing structures. This delayed affection allows societies to appear virtuous without paying the cost of virtue. When someone is right in the present, they create tension because their existence implies that others are wrong or complicit. And this implication is deeply unsettling because it threatens identity, belonging, and self-image. Loving the just too early would require people to admit fear, cowardice, or silence, while loving them later requires only words, ceremonies, and monuments. Admiration after death becomes a form of moral theater where societies perform regret without altering behavior. This is why apologies arrive generations late, and why reformers are praised long after their warnings were ignored. The passage of time transforms conflict into narrative, and narrative is easier to manage than confrontation. Once history turns a living person into a story, their complexity is softened, their radical demands are edited out, and their message is reshaped to fit present values. People say they would have supported them while ignoring the fact that supporting them would have required standing alone, risking status and abandoning comfort. Humans also use hindsight as a way to preserve their self-image by imagining themselves as morally aligned with the past without confronting their present choices. Loving the just afterward allows people to believe they are on the right side of history without having to choose it in real time, because real time demands courage while hindsight demands only interpretation. This tendency reveals a deeper fear, not of injustice itself, but of the social cost of opposing it. Admiration delayed is admiration made harmless, and this harmlessness is precisely why it is allowed. Societies do not struggle to recognize righteousness. They struggle to tolerate it while it is alive, demanding, and inconvenient, and until people learn to value justice when it threatens comfort rather than when it decorates memory, the pattern will continue. The living will be silenced, the dead will be honored, and humanity will keep mistaking retrospective admiration for moral progress, while repeating the same avoidance again and again across eras, cultures, and systems. Power almost always presents itself as order because order sounds protective, reasonable, and necessary, while power alone sounds threatening, and humans are more willing to surrender freedom to something that promises stability than to something that openly seeks control. Order appeals to a deep psychological fear of chaos, uncertainty, and collapse. It suggests predictability, safety, and continuity. And in moments of anxiety, people instinctively prioritize structure over justice, because structure feels like survival power, understands this instinct, and disguises itself as order to legitimize obedience when authority claims to be restoring order. It frames resistance as chaos, dissent as danger, and questioning as irresponsibility. This framing transforms domination into duty and violence into maintenance rather than aggression. Throughout history, nearly every oppressive system justified itself not by admitting hunger for control, but by claiming to prevent disorder. Empires expanded to bring peace. Dictators ruled to preserve stability. Laws were enforced to protect society, even when those laws were unjust, because order provides a moral cover that power alone cannot. It allows those who obey to believe they are not supporting oppression but protecting normality. Order also simplifies moral complexity. It divides the world into stability and threat, insiders and disruptors, good citizens and dangerous elements. And this division makes cruelty feel necessary rather than chosen. Power thrives in this environment because once chaos is framed as the greatest evil, any action taken in the name of order becomes acceptable. Justice becomes secondary because justice slows things down. It introduces debate, nuance, and restraint, qualities that feel dangerous when order is portrayed as fragile. Power exploits this by creating or exaggerating crises because fear accelerates acceptance. People are far more willing to accept harsh authority when they believe collapse is imminent. Order becomes a psychological refuge, a promise that someone else is in control, and that control feels comforting even when it is destructive. Justice, by contrast, appears disruptive because it questions whether the order itself is fair. Power labels this questioning as destabilizing because stability is its strongest argument. Order also allows individuals to outsource responsibility by telling themselves that maintaining peace matters more than examining harm. This mindset turns silence into virtue and obedience into morality. The phrase, "at least there is order," becomes a justification for enduring injustice as long as life feels predictable. Power rarely needs to prove it is right. It only needs to convince people that without it, things would be worse. This false binary between order and chaos leaves no space for justice, because justice requires tolerating temporary discomfort to prevent long-term harm, and discomfort is precisely what order claims to eliminate. The tragic irony is that the order created by power is often brittle, artificial, and sustained through fear rather than trust. But as long as it suppresses visible chaos, it is praised as success even when it silently corrodes dignity, truth, and freedom. People mistake stillness for peace and silence for harmony because power has taught them that noise equals danger and calm equals safety. Justice threatens this illusion by revealing that an unjust order is not order at all, but delayed collapse. Yet because justice does not promise immediate calm, it is dismissed as reckless idealism, while power continues to arrive, wearing the mask of order, offering relief from anxiety while quietly expanding control. And until societies learn to distinguish genuine stability from enforced silence, power will continue to rule, not by declaring itself dominant, but by presenting itself as the only barrier between civilization and chaos, and calling that domination order. Morality is remembered only after crises end, because during crisis, survival replaces conscience and urgency, overwhelms reflection, leaving little space for ethical consideration. When fear dominates the human mind, it narrows priorities to what feels immediately necessary, and anything that slows action is treated as a threat. Morality, by its nature, slows. It asks questions, introduces limits, and demands responsibility. And in moments of instability, these qualities are reframed as dangerous luxuries. Societies tell themselves that there will be time for ethics, later that now is not the moment, and this postponement becomes habitual, because crisis thinking trains people to suspend judgment and normalize compromise. Once morality is delayed, it becomes easier to delay, again and again, until silence feels reasonable and obedience feels mature. Power benefits from this dynamic because crisis creates permission to bypass norms, concentrate authority, and redefine cruelty as necessity under pressure. People accept actions they would otherwise reject because fear reframes them as unavoidable. And when survival is at stake, humans instinctively lower moral standards rather than risk failure. This is why during wars, emergencies, and collapses, Phrases like extraordinary times require extraordinary measures appear. They function as moral anesthetics, dulling conscience until the danger passes. But when the crisis ends and immediate fear subsides, suppressed questions return. People begin to ask whether what was done was justified, whether harm was avoidable, and whether silence was complicity. Morality resurfaces not because society suddenly becomes virtuous, but because the psychological cost of reflection becomes affordable only once safety is restored. It is easier to judge actions retroactively than to restrain them while they are unfolding, because judgment after the fact carries no risk. People can condemn past excesses without threatening present stability, and this creates a pattern where ethics is treated as a postscript. Rather than a guide, morality becomes something discussed in hindsight. Reports, documentaries, and apologies rather than something enforced in real time. The phrase "we had no choice" becomes a shield, used to protect decisions made under fear. Even when alternatives existed, this narrative allows societies to preserve their self-image by framing moral failure as inevitability rather than choice. The uncomfortable truth is that crises do not erase morality. They test it, but because tests are costly, most people prefer to delay rather than endure. Power reinforces this delay by maintaining a permanent sense of emergency, because permanent urgency prevents moral reckoning when everything feels fragile. Questioning authority appears irresponsible. Morality threatens momentum, and momentum is valued more than integrity in systems built on speed control and efficiency. Once the crisis finally ends and consequences can be safely examined, societies express regret, promise reform, and declare lessons learned. Yet these declarations often arrive without structural change, because remembering morality after danger has passed costs nothing and demands little. The harm is already done. The victims already suffered, and the systems already adapted. The cycle then resets, waiting for the next crisis, where morality will again be postponed in the name of necessity. The bitter reality is that morality remembered only after safety returns is not morality but memorialization. It honors values without practicing them and allows societies to believe they are ethical, while repeatedly abandoning ethics whenever fear reappears, until morality is valued precisely during crisis, rather than after it ends. It will remain a decorative principle invoked when convenient and ignored when it matters most, and history will continue to record regret instead of restraint and apologies instead of courage. The most dangerous moment in history is not when power openly oppresses or when violence explodes into chaos, but when ordinary people quietly agree with power while telling themselves they had no choice. Because this is the moment when injustice stops needing force and begins sustaining itself. This moment does not arrive with alarms or declarations. It arrives silently in private decisions, small compromises, and internal justifications. When individuals align with strength not out of belief, but out of convenience, fear, or exhaustion, and label that alignment as realism, responsibility, or maturity. At this point, power no longer has to threaten, it is already internalized. People begin to police themselves, censor their thoughts, and adjust their values to fit what feels safe and acceptable. The system becomes stable not because it is just, but because resistance has been reframed as unreasonable, dangerous, or unnecessary. This is the moment when moral language collapses and is replaced by technical language, procedures, orders, policies, and necessity words that strip actions of ethical weight and turn choices into inevitabilities. The individual tells themselves that someone else is responsible, that now is not the time, that things are complicated, that survival requires silence, and each of these thoughts tightens the structure of power without a single act of visible cruelty. This is why the most dangerous moment is not marked by screams, but by calm routines. meetings, paperwork, and everyday normality, injustice becomes durable when it is normalized. When people stop asking whether something is right and ask only whether it is permitted, expected, or required, history shows that once this threshold is crossed, reversing course becomes extraordinarily difficult, because power no longer stands outside society. It lives inside habits, identities, and shared assumptions. People defend the system not because they love it, but because their sense of safety, reputation, and belonging has become tied to it. Questioning power now feels like questioning oneself. And this psychological fusion is the final defense of unjust systems. The most terrifying aspect of this moment is that it feels reasonable. Those living through it do not see themselves as villains. They see themselves as practical, cautious, and responsible. And this self-perception allows injustice to expand quietly, while everyone waits for someone else to object. Later generations look back and ask, how could they let this happen? Without realizing that the answer lies not in ignorance but in gradual acceptance. The most dangerous moment is when people still believe they are good while enabling harm, because once morality is outsourced to authority, conscience goes silent. And when conscience goes silent, history no longer needs tyrants. It only needs people who are willing to adapt and call that adaptation wisdom. And from that moment forward, injustice no longer appears as a rupture. It appears as order, and correcting it requires not rebellion but awakening, which is far rarer because awakening demands individuals admit that the danger was never only external. It was the moment they chose comfort over truth and told themselves it was unavoidable. If power always wins, then the question is not why justice fails, but why it exists at all. And the answer is uncomfortable, because justice was never designed to conquer. It was designed to preserve humanity. Justice is not a strategy for victory. It is a boundary against becoming what power requires. It is not a tool to overthrow systems, but a line that prevents the individual from dissolving completely into them. Justice does not promise success, safety, or recognition. It promises something far more fragile and far more difficult: alignment between action and conscience. And this alignment has no guarantee of reward, because its purpose is not outcome, but integrity. Power measures value by effectiveness, control, and survival. Justice measures value by meaning, responsibility, and restraint. And these measurements operate on different dimensions. Asking justice to defeat power is like asking truth to overpower force. It misunderstands the function of each. Justice exists not to win history, but to prevent the human being from losing themselves within it. When power triumphs, justice becomes the last remaining witness, reminding individuals that domination is not destiny and obedience is not innocence. Justice marks the point where a person refuses to trade humanity for safety, even when the trade is offered generously and repeatedly. It exists to say there is a cost to survival, when survival demands silence, and that cost is the erosion of self. Justice does not stop empires from rising, but it exposes the moral debt they accumulate. It does not prevent injustice from spreading, but it records its presence, so it cannot fully disguise itself as necessity or order. Justice operates quietly, not because it is weak, but because it addresses something power cannot reach: the inner decision of who a person chooses to be when no reward follows and no protection is offered. This is why justice often appears ineffective. It refuses to compete on power's terms. It will not threaten, bribe, or coerce, because doing so would destroy the very thing it exists to protect. Justice is for the moment when an individual stands alone and decides that certain actions are unacceptable, regardless of consequence. It is for preserving a human standard inside inhuman systems, and this preservation is invisible to history books because it leaves no monuments, no victories, and no immediate change. Yet without it, humanity would become indistinguishable from the forces it fears. Justice is not meant to win. It is meant to resist normalization, to interrupt inevitability, and to remind those who come after that there was another way. Even if it was not taken, power may dominate events, but justice guards meaning, and meaning is what separates endurance from dignity, survival from humanity, and victory from worth. And if justice seems useless in a world where power prevails, that is only because its true function is not external transformation, but internal refusal. It exists so that when history asks not who won, but who remained human, there is still an answer, and that answer does not belong to the powerful. It belongs to those who chose justice, knowing it would not save them, but choosing it anyway. Because without it, survival itself becomes empty, and power without justice becomes indistinguishable from collapse. Human beings tend to imagine a good version of power rather than question power itself, because power feels inevitable while morality feels negotiable, and this belief protects people from confronting a far more unsettling truth, that domination may be the problem regardless of who holds it. Imagining good power allows individuals to preserve faith in control without admitting their dependence on it. People do not ask whether power should exist. They ask who should wield it, because this question feels safer. It assumes that suffering comes from bad intentions rather than from the structure of power itself. This illusion comforts because it suggests that injustice is accidental rather than systemic. If only the right person were in charge, things would be different. This fantasy shifts responsibility away from collective complicity and places it onto individual villains, allowing society to condemn cruelty without questioning obedience. Humans are drawn to this idea because it aligns with a deep psychological need for guardianship power, promises order, protection, and decision-making without effort, while justice demands participation, accountability, and risk. Imagining good power preserves the benefits of authority. While removing its guilt, it allows people to dream of safety without submission, even though the two are inseparable. This is why people defend strong leaders by saying they mean well or they are necessary, because acknowledging that power itself corrupts would mean admitting that the comfort derived from obedience comes at an ethical cost. The myth of good power also simplifies moral complexity. It reduces systemic harm into personal failure, making it easier to fix emotionally without changing structures. Replacing one ruler feels easier than dismantling hierarchies, because dismantling would require people to face uncertainty and responsibility without a substitute authority. Humans also mistake restraint for benevolence. When power does not abuse visibly, it is labeled good, even if it still concentrates control, limits freedom, and silences dissent. Absence of cruelty is confused with presence of justice, but justice is not merely softer domination. It is a fundamentally different relationship, based on equality rather than hierarchy. The fantasy of good power survives because it allows people to believe they can remain protected without becoming complicit. It reassures them that obedience can be moral as long as the authority is kind. Yet history repeatedly shows that even kind power eventually relies on coercion, because power cannot function without enforcement. When enforcement appears benevolent, people stop resisting until resistance is no longer possible. Imagining good power delays confrontation with this reality. It keeps hope alive while preserving the same dynamics of control. This is why revolutions often replace rulers but keep structures intact, because people seek better masters, not freedom from mastery. The dream of good power is easier to sustain than the courage required to imagine a society where authority is limited, questioned, and shared, because such a society demands constant vigilance, participation, and moral effort. Power offers relief from that effort by centralizing decision-making and responsibility, and humans exhausted by uncertainty accept this trade believing that safety is worth the cost. The most dangerous part of this fantasy is that it frames criticism of power as cynicism or extremism, because if good power is possible, then questioning power itself appears unreasonable, unrealistic, or destructive. This protects power from deeper scrutiny and ensures its survival under new names and faces. The illusion persists because it meets emotional needs, not logical ones. It promises rescue without vulnerability, order without effort, and morality without sacrifice. And as long as people crave these comforts, they will continue to search for better rulers rather than question why they need rulers at all, mistaking the hope for good power as progress while leaving the underlying relationship between authority and obedience untouched and unchallenged across generations. Justice survives through individuals rather than systems, because justice is a moral relationship, while systems are functional mechanisms, and these two operate according to fundamentally different logics. Systems are designed to endure, optimize, and reproduce themselves. They value efficiency, predictability, and stability above all else. And in order to achieve these goals, they must standardize behavior, reduce complexity, and suppress exception. Justice resists all of these requirements because justice is contextual. It depends on attention, empathy, and judgment, which cannot be automated or evenly distributed. Once justice is absorbed into a system, it must be translated into rules, procedures, and policies, and in that translation, its essence is lost because rules cannot feel compassion, procedures cannot perceive nuance, and policies cannot respond to singular human suffering. Systems do not act, they execute, and execution requires neutrality. Justice is not neutral. It demands discrimination in the moral sense, the ability to see difference, respond uniquely, and accept responsibility for outcomes. This is why systems often claim to deliver justice. While producing injustice at scale, they replace moral judgment with protocol, allowing harm to occur without anyone feeling accountable. When injustice is systemic, everyone participates but no one decides. And this diffusion of responsibility is lethal to justice, because justice requires a decision maker who can say, "This stops here," even if the rules allow it. Individuals can make this decision, systems cannot, because systems punish deviation. They reward consistency and stability. Even when stability sustains harm, justice therefore survives only in moments where an individual interrupts the system, refusing to perform a role mechanically and choosing conscience over compliance. This interruption is costly because systems are hostile to unpredictability. They interpret moral refusal as error, disloyalty, or threat, and they respond by isolating, correcting, or removing the individual. This creates the illusion that justice is impractical because it does not scale. But justice was never meant to scale. It was meant to prevent humans from becoming instruments. Systems grow by reducing people to functions. Justice lives by insisting that people remain persons. When justice is systematized, it becomes law. When law is detached from conscience, it becomes permission rather than protection. History shows that the worst atrocities were not committed by chaotic mobs, but by well-organized systems operating smoothly according to rules, while individuals reassured themselves that they were simply doing their jobs. Justice could not survive in these environments because it had nowhere to reside once individuals surrendered judgment to structure. Yet even in the most rigid systems, justice reappeared through singular acts of refusal. A guard who looks away, a clerk who alters a record, a neighbor who hides a stranger. These acts rarely dismantle systems, but they preserve humanity within them. Justice lives in these interruptions, not because they are efficient, but because they are human, and humanity cannot be fully encoded. Justice is fragile because it depends on choice. and choice cannot be enforced without destroying its meaning. Systems can enforce behavior, but they cannot enforce conscience, which is why justice must remain personal. If it is to remain real, the moment justice becomes fully institutionalized, it stops being justice and becomes management. Fairness becomes policy, and morality becomes compliance. This transformation allows societies to function, but at the cost of ethical depth. Individuals then point to systems to absolve themselves, saying the rules were followed. The process was correct. Even as harm spreads, justice survives. Only where someone is willing to step outside this logic and accept personal risk. Because without risk, justice becomes cosmetic, and without individuals willing to bear that risk, systems will always drift toward convenience, efficiency, and self-preservation rather than truth, compassion, or accountability. Justice is not weak because it lacks structure. It is alive because it refuses to become one. And as long as there are individuals willing to interrupt systems rather than hide inside them, justice will continue to exist quietly, vulnerably, and incompletely, not as a victory but as resistance against becoming less human. Human beings often treat silence as moral innocence because silence feels passive and passivity feels harmless. Yet this belief is one of the most dangerous self-deceptions in history, because it allows people to participate in harm while preserving the image of goodness. The sentence "I did nothing" is not a statement of neutrality. It is a psychological shield used to avoid responsibility. Silence is attractive because it creates distance between action and consequence. When a person speaks, they are exposed. They choose a side. They risk punishment, exclusion, and loss. But when they remain silent, they can tell themselves that events happened without their involvement, that harm occurred independently of their presence. This illusion comforts because it allows people to witness injustice without integrating it into their identity. They are not perpetrators, they are observers, and observers believe they are clean. History, however, shows that systems of cruelty do not survive on active violence alone. They survive on passive acceptance, on people who do not intervene, do not object, and do not disrupt. Silence becomes the environment in which harm feels normal, and inevitability replaces choice. Humans prefer silence because it preserves belonging. Speaking up threatens social bonds, reputations, and safety, while silence protects them. Silence also allows people to postpone moral reckoning. They tell themselves that the situation is complicated, that they lack information, that now is not the right time. And each delay transforms conscience into background noise until it fades entirely. The lie of "I did nothing" works because morality is often defined narrowly as action rather than responsibility. If a person did not strike the blow, they feel absolved, even if their silence enabled the hand that did. Silence is framed as restraint, wisdom, or prudence. But restraint without resistance is surrender, and prudence without principle is avoidance. Societies reinforce this lie by rewarding quiet compliance and punishing visible dissent, teaching people that staying out of trouble is more important than staying aligned with truth over time. This conditioning turns silence into habit and habit into character. People no longer feel that they are choosing silence. It feels natural, reasonable, and even virtuous. The most disturbing aspect of this lie is that it allows injustice to expand without villains. People continue their daily routines convinced of their innocence, while harm grows around them, supported by their non-action. Silence is not empty. It communicates consent. It signals to power that resistance is absent and that limits can be pushed further. History shows that every large-scale injustice required not only aggressors, but a majority willing to remain quiet, because silence stabilizes systems. By removing friction, it lowers the cost of cruelty by ensuring it faces no immediate challenge. And once silence becomes widespread, it rewrites morality itself. Those who speak are seen as troublemakers, extremists, or irresponsible, while those who remain silent are seen as normal, balanced, and mature. This inversion corrupts ethical judgment because it confuses peace with absence of noise and goodness with absence of action. The phrase "I did nothing" hides a deeper truth. Something was happening and I chose not to interfere. This choice may feel small, but multiplied across thousands or millions, it becomes decisive. Silence becomes collective, and collective silence becomes structure. At that point, injustice no longer needs enforcement, it becomes routine. And when the consequences finally surface, people express shock, regret, and disbelief, unable or unwilling to recognize their own role, because acknowledging it would require admitting that morality was abandoned, not through evil intent, but through comfort, fear, and the desire to remain untouched. The most painful realization is that silence is rarely neutral. It is alignment disguised as absence, and the lie of "I did nothing" allows people to survive unjust times without confronting what survival cost them in human terms. And until silence is recognized as participation rather than innocence, injustice will continue to rely on ordinary people who believe they are doing no harm simply because they refuse to act, while harm unfolded in front of them. Justice can never become a collective slogan because slogans are designed to simplify. While justice exists to complicate, slogans must be short, repeatable, emotionally charged, and easily shared. They reduce reality into a shape that can be carried by crowds without reflection. Justice resists this reduction because it is situational, demanding attention to context, motive, and consequence. A slogan tells people what to think. Justice forces people to decide how to act, and this difference makes justice incompatible with mass repetition. Slogans create unity by eliminating nuance. Justice creates responsibility by insisting on it. A slogan works best when it can be shouted. Without understanding, justice fails the moment it is repeated without thought, because its meaning depends on judgment, empathy, and awareness, which cannot be synchronized across a crowd. Collective movements rely on shared language that feels certain and absolute. But justice is rarely absolute. It asks uncomfortable questions. It exposes contradictions, and it refuses to offer simple enemies or simple solutions. This makes it slow, difficult, and resistant to mobilization. Power understands this and replaces justice with slogans that imitate morality without requiring moral effort. Words like freedom, order, security, and unity sound ethical, while remaining vague enough to justify almost anything. Justice cannot hide behind vagueness. It demands specificity. Who is harmed? Who benefits? Who is excluded? And who decides? These questions fracture crowds because they force individuals to confront their own position within the system. Slogans protect unity by directing attention outward. Justice threatens unity by turning attention inward, asking each person to examine their choices. Silence and complicity. Collective slogans also rely on emotional synchronization. They amplify anger, pride, fear, or hope to move people together. Justice rarely uses these emotions because they overwhelm judgment. Justice requires restraint, and restraint does not travel well through crowds. It lacks spectacle. It does not excite. It slows momentum, and momentum is what collective action feeds on. This is why movements that begin with moral intent often replace justice with slogans over time, because sustaining mass energy requires simplification. Once justice is translated into a slogan, it stops being justice and becomes identity. People no longer ask whether actions are right. They ask whether they align with the slogan. Morality becomes loyalty, dissent becomes betrayal, and conscience becomes noise. Justice cannot survive in this environment because it refuses to subordinate itself to group identity. It does not say we are right. It asks what is right, even if the answer separates rather than unites. This is why justice repeatedly appears as a solitary voice within collective movements. someone who interrupts chance with questions, someone who refuses to justify harm for the sake of unity. And these figures are often treated as obstacles rather than guides because they slow progress and expose moral shortcuts. The tragic irony is that slogans are remembered while justice is forgotten, even though slogans are empty without justice. Behind them, history preserves the words while erasing the conscience that once challenged them. Justice never becomes a collective slogan because it cannot be delegated. It cannot be outsourced to a chant, a banner, or a crowd. It must be carried individually, renewed constantly, and defended without guarantee of support, and this makes it fragile but also honest. Justice does not promise belonging, it promises responsibility. And responsibility cannot be shared without dissolving its meaning, which is why justice remains quiet, singular, and resistant to mass expression, while slogans echo loudly across history, leaving behind noise without depth, unity without integrity, and movements that remember the words but forget the reason they once mattered. History does not choose what is right. It chooses what functions, and this distinction explains why certain behaviors are repeated, rewarded, and normalized across centuries while others disappear quietly without trace. History favors actions that produce visible outcomes, quickly actions that consolidate control, expand territory, stabilize systems, and silence resistance because these behaviors leave marks that can be recorded, measured, and taught. Restraint rarely leaves monuments. Patience does not redraw borders, and moral hesitation does not generate statistics. The behaviors history selects are those that simplify complexity into dominance, obedience, efficiency, and survival. Power aligns perfectly with these criteria. It acts decisively. It reshapes reality, and it leaves behind structures that persist long enough to define memory. Justice, by contrast, often interrupts rather than constructs. It slows rather than accelerates, and it questions rather than enforces, which makes it difficult to record and easy to erase. History is written through cause and effect, but it privileges affects thee. Power demands only adaptation because adaptation is easier than transformation, and survival is easier than integrity. Power does not ask people to believe in it or even to approve of it. It asks only that they adjust their behavior to fit its shape. This is why power is so resilient. It does not rely on conviction. It relies on flexibility. A person does not have to agree with power to live under it. They only have to learn its language, its limits, and its punishments. Adaptation allows people to remain internally conflicted while externally compliant, and this separation creates psychological comfort because it avoids confrontation between conscience and action. Power thrives on this distance. It allows individuals to tell themselves that they are still good, still moral, still unchanged, while quietly reshaping their behavior day by day. Justice cannot operate this way because justice demands transformation. It requires alignment between belief and action, and that alignment is costly. It cannot be partial or postponed without losing meaning. Adaptation, by contrast, is gradual, almost invisible. People do not feel themselves crossing moral lines. They simply take small steps to fit new conditions, a new rule, a new silence, a new justification. Each step feels minor and reversible, but together they create a complete moral shift without a single dramatic choice. This is why power prefers adaptation over loyalty, because loyalty can break, but adaptation becomes habit once behavior adjusts. Values follow because the human mind seeks coherence between what it does and what it believes. Power exploits this by changing behavior, first knowing that belief will eventually adapt to reduce discomfort. People stop asking whether something is right and begin asking whether it is normal, permitted, or required. And this shift marks the moment when power no longer needs enforcement. Adaptation turns injustice into routine and routine into background noise. individuals no longer feel they are choosing power, they feel they are simply navigating reality. Power presents itself as neutral, practical, and inevitable precisely to encourage this mindset. It frames resistance as unrealistic and refusal as dangerous, while portraying adaptation as maturity, wisdom, and responsibility. Justice threatens this process because it interrupts adaptation. It forces people to stop, adjust, and reevaluate, and reevaluation slows systems that depend on momentum. This is why those who refuse to adapt are labeled extremists, troublemakers, or impractical. They disrupt the smooth functioning of power by insisting on friction. Adaptation also allows power to scale because it does not require mass enthusiasm. Only mass compliance. People can adapt quietly, individually, and privately, without coordination, which makes resistance fragmented and rare. Justice requires collective courage or individual sacrifice, both of which are difficult to sustain. Adaptation requires neither. It allows people to survive without standing for anything, and this is its greatest strength and its greatest danger, because a society built entirely on adaptation can function efficiently, while hollowing out its moral core. Power does not need people to change who they are. It only needs them to stop being who they were, and this subtraction is subtle. It happens not through violence, but through normalization, until people wake up one day, unable to recognize the distance between their original values and their current behavior. Adaptation has erased that memory, and power has succeeded, not by conquering minds, but by reshaping habits. Justice cannot compete with this quiet efficiency because it refuses to compromise on alignment. It demands that individuals confront discomfort now, rather than adjust slowly into silence. And because discomfort is avoided whenever possible, most choose adaptation over transformation, not realizing that adaptation to injustice is itself a form of participation, and that power's greatest achievement is not obedience, but the disappearance of resistance without anyone noticing when it happened. Silence is morally cleaned by language, habit, and collective agreement, until it no longer appears as a choice, but as a virtue. And this transformation is one of the most effective mechanisms through which injustice survives. Silence is never presented as surrender. It is presented as caution, maturity, realism, or responsibility. People are taught that not speaking is wiser than speaking, that waiting is smarter than acting, and that staying quiet is safer than standing out. And through repetition, this framing strips silence of its moral weight, turning it into something neutral or even admirable. The first step in cleaning silence is redefining harm. Morality is narrowed so that only direct action counts as wrongdoing, while inaction is excluded from judgment. If you did not strike the blow, you are innocent. If you did not give the order, you are blameless. This selective definition allows people to witness injustice without feeling implicated, because observation is treated as absence rather than participation. The second step is normalizing delay. People tell themselves that the situation is complex, that more information is needed, that now is not the right time, and each delay feels reasonable on its own. But together they form permanent avoidance. Time becomes a moral solvent, dissolving urgency until conscience fades. The third step is social reinforcement. Silence is rewarded subtly through acceptance, stability, and safety, while speaking out is punished through isolation, ridicule, or threat. This teaches people that silence maintains belonging, and belonging feels like goodness, because exclusion is painful. Societies rarely need to enforce silence aggressively, because people internalize it quickly once they see who is praised and who is discarded. Silence is also cleaned by comparison. Individuals reassure themselves that others are worse, that their own silence is minor relative to greater evils, and this comparison allows them to feel moral. Without acting, morality becomes a relative scale rather than an absolute demand. Silence is further purified by necessity. narratives people are told that circumstances left no alternative, that survival required compromise, and that resistance would have changed nothing. These narratives transform silence from choice into inevitability, removing responsibility from the individual and placing it onto abstract forces, history, context, or fate over time. Repeated silence becomes habit, and habit becomes character. People no longer feel that they are choosing to remain quiet. It feels natural, appropriate, and even ethical. Silence is then woven into identity. I am not political, I am neutral, I am just trying to live my life. And these identities function as moral armor, protecting individuals from confronting their own alignment with power. The most insidious part of this cleaning process is that silence begins to feel peaceful. The absence of conflict is mistaken for harmony, and the absence of resistance is mistaken for stability. People confuse calm with goodness because noise has been framed as danger and disruption. Once silence is fully cleaned, those who break it are perceived as aggressors rather than witnesses. They are accused of creating division, provoking chaos, or being extreme, while the silent majority is seen as balanced, reasonable, and mature. At this stage, injustice no longer needs defense. Silence itself has become its shield. And when consequences finally emerge, when harm becomes undeniable, people express shock and regret, claiming they did not know or could not act, forgetting that silence was never empty. It was a constant signal of permission. Silence is not the absence of morality. It is morality redirected inward to protect comfort rather than outward to confront harm. And the final lie that completes the cleaning process is the belief that silence keeps one clean, when in reality silence is what allows dirt to spread unnoticed, unchallenged, and normalized until it becomes the background of everyday life. And by the time society decides to speak, the silence has already done its work, not loudly, not violently, but patiently, efficiently, and with the full participation of those who believed they were doing nothing at all. What endures is not victory, but the traces left behind, because victory is an event, while traces are consequences, and history is shaped far more by what remains than by who won. Victories announce themselves loudly with dates, ceremonies, and declarations, but their noise fades quickly while traces settle slowly into culture, memory, language, and behavior, shaping lives long after the banners are gone. Power chases victory because victory looks like proof. It can be displayed, counted, and recorded, but justice does not aim for victory because victory often ends inquiry. It closes questions and declares completion. Traces do the opposite. They linger, they disturb, they ask to be interpreted. A society can win a war and still lose its humanity, but the loss may only become visible generations later in trauma, mistrust, normalized cruelty, and inherited fear. These are traces, not defeats, and they cannot be erased by rewriting outcomes. Harsh actions often produce quick victories, but they leave deep marks. Resentment cycles of violence and moral numbness that persist long after control is secured. Mercy may appear to lose in the short term because it refuses decisive domination, but when it is practiced, it leaves different traces: trust, restraint, the memory that violence was not inevitable. These traces are subtle and therefore undervalued because they do not fit into narratives of success. History remembers victories because they are easy to tell, but lives are shaped by traces because they are impossible to avoid. People grow up inside them without knowing where they came from, learning behaviors, fears, and assumptions that feel natural but were inherited from past choices. This is why judging the past by its victories is misleading, because the real legacy of an era is not its triumphs, but its after effects. The institutions it normalized, the silences it taught, and the boundaries it erased. Power may win today, but the traces it leaves determine whether tomorrow will be livable. Justice may fail to win, but the traces it leaves preserve the possibility of dignity in hostile conditions. A person who refuses to comply may not change the outcome, but they leave a trace, a memory that resistance existed, a crack in inevitability, a signal to those who come after that the world was not unanimous. This trace may seem insignificant compared to victory, but it is often the only thing that prevents history from appearing total, complete, and justified systems. Fear traces more than defeats, because defeats can be reframed, absorbed, and corrected. But traces persist quietly, undermining narratives of necessity. They cannot be punished once they exist, because they live in memory, example, and absence. The absence of cruelty, the absence of silence, the absence of obedience that did not happen. And this absence speaks louder over time than any victory. Justice is not measured by winning, because winning often belongs to those willing to sacrifice. Everything else, justice is measured by what it refuses to destroy, even when destruction would be effective, and those refusals leave marks in how people treat one another, what they tolerate, and what they remember. Victory ends. Stories' traces begin them. And while history celebrates winners, life unfolds inside the residues they leave behind, teaching future generations not who prevailed, but what kind of world that victory created and whether it was worth surviving at all. Justice is a burden rather than a result, because it does not resolve tension. It creates it, and it does not close responsibility. It opens it. Results offer closure. They signal completion, success, and relief. They allow people to move on, believing something has been achieved. Justice does the opposite. It refuses closure. It insists that attention remain active and that responsibility never be fully discharged. A result can be pointed to, measured, and celebrated. Justice cannot, because justice is not an outcome. It is an ongoing demand placed on the individual conscience. It requires continuous awareness, judgment, and restraint. And this constancy is exhausting. People want justice to behave like victory, because victory ends effort. But justice never ends effort. It follows individuals into every decision, every silence, and every compromise, asking again whether what is being done is acceptable. Results. Reward justice burdens results. Simplify justice complicates. This is why people instinctively resist justice, even while praising it in theory, because praise costs nothing, while practice costs energy, comfort, and safety. Justice offers no finish line, because the moment it becomes a result, it turns into justification. Once justice is declared achieved, it can be used to excuse harm committed. In its name, history shows that whenever justice is framed as an accomplished goal, it quickly becomes a shield behind which power hides, declaring that fairness has been secured while inequality persists. Justice, therefore, must remain unfinished to remain honest, and this unfinished state feels like weight, because it denies people the relief of believing they are done. Being responsible, a burden, is something carried forward, while a result is something left behind. Justice insists on being carried. It demands that individuals remain alert to harm, even when rules allow it, even when outcomes appear positive, and even when silence would be easier. This burden is personal. It cannot be shared without dilution, and it cannot be delegated without corruption. Systems promise justice as a result precisely because systems cannot carry burdens. They operate on completion, efficiency, and finality. Individuals can carry burdens because they can feel guilt, doubt, and care. Justice survives only where someone is willing to accept this weight, without certainty that it will change anything. Justice does not promise improvement. It promises integrity. And integrity is heavy because it requires refusing benefits gained through harm and accepting losses incurred through restraint. People often ask, what did justice achieve? But this question misunderstands justice entirely, because justice is not meant to achieve. It is meant to prevent it. Prevents normalization of cruelty, It prevents surrender of conscience. It prevents the individual from becoming fully aligned with unjust systems. These preventions leave no visible trace and therefore feel like nothing happened, which makes the burden feel pointless. Yet this invisibility is precisely what gives justice its value. It guards what cannot be restored, once lost dignity, trust. Humanity, a person who carries justice, often appears to gain nothing and lose much, because the burden extracts a price immediately, while offering no reward. Later, this imbalance makes justice feel unreasonable in a world trained to measure worth by results. But justice measures worth by refusal, by what one chose not to do, even when doing it would have been effective, profitable, or safe. This refusal weighs heavily because it isolates. It slows progress and it invites doubt, not only from others but from oneself. The just person must live with uncertainty, wondering whether their burden mattered, whether it changed anything, and whether the cost was worth it. Results silence these questions. Justice amplifies them, which is why people crave results and avoid justice. They want an end to responsibility, not a deepening of it, yet without those willing to carry justice as a burden, results become empty victories and systems become efficient machines for harm. Justice is heavy because it preserves the possibility of remaining human under conditions that reward inhumanity, and that preservation has no endpoint, no ceremony, and no applause. Only the quiet knowledge that something worse was not done, and that knowledge must be carried alone without proof that it was necessary. Justice is a burden because it refuses to let people rest inside outcomes and insists instead that they remain accountable to meaning, and meaning, unlike results, never stops asking for its weight to be borne. Power comforts people because it removes uncertainty, while justice unsettles them because it exposes it, and the human mind instinctively seeks relief from uncertainty more than alignment with truth. Power offers psychological rest. It promises that decisions have already been made, that responsibility has been assigned, and that consequences are managed elsewhere. This creates a sense of calm, even when the situation itself is unjust, because calm does not come from goodness, it comes from predictability. Power tells people where they stand, who they are, and what is expected of them. And this clarity feels like safety because ambiguity is exhausting. Justice offers no such relief. Justice refuses to finalize meaning. It reopens questions that power works hard to close. It asks whether obedience is acceptable, whether silence is complicit, and whether comfort is being purchased at someone else's expense. These questions disturb because they do not come with instructions or guarantees. They force individuals to think, choose, and remain alert. And constant alertness is emotionally taxing. Power allows people to rest by surrendering agency. Justice keeps people awake by returning it. Power simplifies moral life into roles, rules, and permissions. Justice complicates it by insisting that context, intention, and impact matter. Even when the rules allow harm, this complication creates discomfort because it denies people the refuge of saying, "I followed the rules," or "I had no choice." Justice removes excuses, and when excuses disappear, people must confront themselves. And that confrontation is deeply unsettling. Power also soothes because it absorbs guilt when actions are taken under authority. Individuals can distance themselves from outcomes, believing that responsibility belongs to the system. Justice collapses this distance. It insists that participation matters, that silence communicates, and that inaction shapes results. This insistence feels threatening because it leaves no neutral ground. Power provides neutrality. Justice denies it. Power says stay within the structure and you will be protected. Justice says stand where you must, even if no one protects you, and this difference explains why power feels like comfort, while justice feels like exposure. Power creates belonging. And belonging reduces anxiety because it reassures people they are not alone. Justice often isolates, and isolation amplifies anxiety because it removes social validation. People fear being wrong alone more than being wrong together, and power exploits this fear by rewarding conformity. Justice unsettles because it demands integrity. Without witnesses, approval, or reward, it requires people to act without knowing whether they will be supported, remembered, or vindicated. Power comforts because it aligns with human avoidance of pain. It allows people to live without constantly measuring themselves against their values. Justice unsettles because it refuses to let values become abstract. It brings them into direct contact with behavior and forces reconciliation between the two. This reconciliation is painful because it reveals compromise, hypocrisy, and fear. Qualities people would rather keep buried. Power offers emotional anesthesia. It dulls conscience by replacing it with procedure. Justice removes anesthesia and exposes raw nerve endings. People often describe this exposure as stress disruption or instability, but it is simply awareness, and awareness is uncomfortable in a world organized to minimize discomfort. This is why societies gravitate towards strong authority during uncertain times, because uncertainty already strains the psyche, and justice would add further strain by questioning responses. Power promises immediate relief. Justice promises none. It offers only the burden of remaining honest in conditions that reward dishonesty. The deepest reason justice unsettles is that it does not allow people to feel finished. Power allows people to believe they have done enough, complied enough, adapted enough. Justice insists that enough is never guaranteed, that moral responsibility is ongoing and cannot be delegated, postponed, or completed. This endless demand feels oppressive to those seeking peace, yet it is the only force that prevents peace from becoming numbness, comfort from becoming complicity, and order from becoming quiet harm. Power relaxes people by lowering the bar. Justice disturbs them by raising it, and as long as comfort is valued more than consciousness, power will always feel like relief, while justice will feel like a disturbance that threatens the fragile calm built on not looking too closely.